Good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the 13th meeting in 2013 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everyone to switch off any mobile devices as they affect the broadcasting system, although some committee members may consult tablets during the meeting as we provide the agenda in digital format and members will be accessing briefing papers for this committee. We have apologies from Adam Ingram and Gil Patterson is attending as the substitute. Agenda item 1 is community transport. The first item of business today is to hear evidence from the Minister for Transport and Veterans as part of the committee's inquiry into community transport. This is the 5th and final oral evidence session on this inquiry. So today can I welcome Keith Brown, Minister for Transport and Veterans, and Tom Davey, Team Leader, Bus and Local Transport Policy of the Scottish Government. Can I welcome you, Minister, and invite you to briefly introduce your official and make a brief opening statement.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener, and thanks for the chance to come along to the committee to speak as part of your inquiry into community transport. And I should say that I will, of course, I think as I've already said, look forward to seeing the conclusions of the committee's inquiry and to giving them further consideration, not least the contributions which have been made by the organisations which have spoken to the committee. I welcome the insight into the opportunities that community organisations have identified and the concerns which they've expressed in providing transport to communities throughout Scotland. I think it's true to say that people in Scotland have a remarkable awareness of what will help others in their communities and an awareness that can help ensure that communities thrive. And we saw some of that in the debate we had last week in the Chamber. I'm grateful for the time everyone has taken to share their understanding and concerns. I'm also aware that you will hear further from the Health and Sport Committee to add to your evidence on transport to healthcare. And I know that healthcare colleagues are working with some of the regional transport partnerships and others to tackle some of the challenges that we face in this area. I've had a number of discussions with the Cabinet Secretary for Health on this issue, in fact dating back to the time when he was the Cabinet Secretary for Investment and Infrastructure, and work on that is ongoing. Public transport, as you'll be aware, is provided by many commercial operators to many rural areas. By reforming the Bus Service Operators Grant in 2012, I've tried to ensure that rural services benefit from mileage-related payments which favour longer routes. It's also more environmentally sustainable. And smaller operators have told me that they appreciate the difference that these payments have made. However, it's also true to say that some routes may still not be sustainable on a purely commercial basis, and that's where, of course, local authorities can step in to commission and fund bus services to meet people's needs where the market can't. And importantly, in the context of today's discussion, other local solutions, often run by communities themselves, can make an important contribution too, especially in some of the more isolated rural areas. Age Scotland stress in their research into this subject that transport services are crucial and are appreciated by older people. They also present some useful information from the Community Transport Association for consideration about the scope of the sector. And their research, Age Scotland's research, shows that around 100,000 people benefit from community transport in Scotland each year. Currently 70,000 people, older people use community transport, and there are 3.5 million community transport trips per year. 62% of community transport users are aged 16 or older, 16% of users are disabled, and they also estimate that overall demand may rise to around 83,500 older users by 2022. Age Scotland, as you know, call for concessionary travel arrangements to be extended to community transport. There are some practical issues around this, which were mentioned again in the debate last week, over and above the issue, of course, of affordability and sustainability. But as I've said, I will be listening to the points made as the campaign progresses. On your investigation, you've heard from many organisations which provide transport to their members and users, and there have been many examples given where there are dedicated volunteers who enable these services to be provided, sometimes over many years, to the local communities. And I'm not surprised to hear that volunteers are not easy to come by. For my part, I admire the commitment made by each and every person to become drivers or escorts or passengers, and I think we all know people in our own areas who do that kind of work. Training and qualifications for these volunteers seems to be essential to support the quality of the services. But the training concerns discussed and evidence leave some questions about how best the sector might develop and how much the organisations themselves are able to supply the training that's required. In fact, the examples show that the flexible and responsive nature of community transport projects serve the communities very well, and there is enthusiasm for that kind of development. On the National Concessionary Travel Scheme for Older and Disabled People, it is a very successful scheme which is providing free local and long distance travel, bus travel throughout Scotland for older and disabled people at any time of day for any number of journeys. And currently around 1.25 million people hold those cards and have access to those benefits. In January, as you know, we reached an agreement with the bus industry which safeguarded the scheme for the next 2 years, and that 2-year agreement provides fair reimbursement for operators and it secures the financial sustainability of the scheme. The scheme is for registered bus services. We don't have any current plans to extend the scheme to include community transport services other than those which are registered bus services, whether conventional or demand responsive. And last year I enabled community transport organisations who run flexible services under Section 22 registrations, which are open to the public, to be part of the concessionary travel scheme, and that's an option that I'm aware for some providers but not for others. Over and above the National Free Bus Travel Scheme, local authorities have powers to allow them to support travel concessions, and some local authorities do that for trains, for ferries and for taxis. And as you've heard, community transport providers may be contracted for some of these local authority contracted services. For example, Strathclyde Passenger Partnership for Transport is already coordinating a forum for community transport operators, which will, we hope, help to develop the sector, and that's to be welcomed. However, with quality in mind, the concerns of the community transport providers are of course concerns for us all, and I look forward to the conclusions and recommendations from the committee's inquiry. There is no doubt in my mind that community transport has a place in Scotland as we build a transport system fit for the 21st century, and I'm very open to practical suggestions on how best we can achieve that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Margaret, would you like to begin the questioning, please?
Good morning, Minister. The committee has actually heard evidence that there's a lack of basic information on community transport provision, funding and also the assessment of unmet needs across Scotland. Do you see a role for Transport Scotland and or the CTA in leading or coordinating research to establish such a baseline information service?
I think that's one of the outcomes of your inquiry, which we will look very closely at. Obviously, CTA is there just now to provide that coordinating role, to provide that role in terms of representation. Although the question of whether further research, and CTA do undertake some research, as I understand it, both I think within Scotland and across the UK, and obviously they have the benefit of the feedback they have from their members as well. But perhaps that issue ties in with the idea which has been proposed for a national strategy, which would obviously have to be based on that kind of research. And as I say, I'm willing to wait and see what the committee's conclusions are in relation to that before coming to a conclusion myself.
Thank you. There have been calls for the Scottish Government to develop a national community strategy, you've already said. I mean, how long is it actually going to take for this to be sort of done and we actually hear what the results of it is?
Well, this is the first inquiry, certainly in my time in this job, into that area. So it's not something that's been repeatedly called for, to me certainly, but this has been suggested. So, as I've said, the length of time it would take to do it would obviously follow on from a decision that we should actually do this, and we're not ready to make that decision just now. We will wait and see what the committee's inquiry comes up with. I do see merits in it, there's no question of that. It's a question of how it should be pulled together. It is obviously a collection of, throughout the country, very diverse groups that currently provide this, and they often, the role is a local one, and it's one which is either born from a charitable source or a third sector source, and there is a potential danger in a national strategy which tries to be sort of top down. So, because you don't want to frustrate or inhibit that kind of development, but the idea of having a national strategy that has other merits because it lets everyone know what the framework is. I can see that point, but I would rather wait and see what the committee's conclusions are before coming to a conclusion myself.
Alex.
Thank you, Convener. Among many of the other funding pressures that we've discussed with witnesses, one issue that came up was the difficulties of replacing vehicles. I've got a couple of quotes here. One organisation told us that new vehicles are urgently needed, but funding for them is very hard to come by. Another organisation told us that the lack of capital funding for vehicle replacement is threatening the continued existence of some community transport groups. So the first question I'd like to ask is, can you see the possibility that the Scottish Government could do anything to support community transport groups in purchasing new vehicles?
Yeah, obviously, that is a possibility. The difficulty, as you've rightly mentioned, is finding the funding to do that. I'm aware from having seen the work that the committee's done and from listening to community transport providers themselves and from speaking to some individual members of this committee about that pressure. And obviously it should be the case where these services are provided that to some extent the charge that's made, where a charge is made, should take into account the cost of capital replacement of vehicles. It should take into account the cost of training. But I realise that's not always possible. And I also realise that across the piece, the fleet, if you like, if you can call it that, a collective fleet, is becoming more dated, not least because funding pressures, whether it's local authorities or other charities, or the move to single-year funding, which makes it hard to plan. I realise there are issues there. So yes, it is possible to do that. We will look at what we could possibly do to achieve that, whether that's through the transport brief or through its third sector brief to support third sector organisations. I think if we were to do it, though, one thing that would be, I think, important to look at very closely is whether in doing so, we could also encourage more environmentally friendly vehicles in the way that we've done with the Green Bus Fund, for example. The difficulty with that is that there's not a lot in terms of the market just now to supply that, but I think that would be worth looking at. So once again, I think it's worth taking the starting point. It's what the committee comes up with, see what their recommendations are, but we are aware of that pressure. We have had representations on that, and we are looking at that.
During discussions with witnesses, we've had, on a number of occasions, we've had the discussion surrounding the possibility of leasing vehicles as an option in this area. However, a number of things, including, as you mentioned, the move to single-year funding, makes leasing very difficult for a lot of these organisations. Do you see Transport Scotland or regional transport partnerships or perhaps local authorities having a role in supporting transport operators to lease vehicles?
Well, the issue of whether either RTPs or councils, that it would be an issue for them. I'm aware that if there's to be investment from any part of the public purse, everybody that's involved in that, whether councils, RTPs or the government, would want to make sure that was done on the most sustainable basis and the most efficient basis possible. So that might be something that argues for, going back to the previous point, about a national strategy. So you can do these things on a, rather than a leasing agreement for a particular provider, perhaps a very small provider, doing it on a bigger scale, which might mean you can get more efficiencies. But as to whether individual councils or RTPs could do that, of course they could do that, but it would be their decision to do it. And RTPs, perhaps you could say, well, because they cover a broader area, not always, but in many cases a broader area than one authority, perhaps it's something that RTPs would be interested in looking at, I think, as well.
Thank you.
Okay, Jim.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, can I ask you about the bus service operators grant? You said in your introductory remarks that the grant had undergone a shift from total fuel consumed to total distance travelled, and that this had delivered significant benefits in rural areas. And in fact, that is a point that was reflected in the evidence which the committee received. One of our witnesses, Wayne Pearson of HCL, told the committee on the 1st of May that his organisation had received, and I quote, a windfall, and that the changes have helped us substantially. Well, that's the good news, but you also said in your introductory remarks that some routes are not sustainable on a commercial basis. I'm just wondering, do you see a role for BSOG in addressing what is an example of market failure in order to provide the certainty that community transport providers are looking for?
No, I don't think that's the primary role of BSOG. I think that the changes that we made that you mentioned, first of all, just seem to me to be self-evidently sensible, because they rewarded, instead of rewarding fuel consumption, they rewarded distance travelled, and also stopped rewarding dead mileage, whereby there was nobody on the bus at all. I think that's a sensible thing to do. I'm not sure whether BSOG would be and BSOG is a benefit to existing operators, and to the extent that bit it helps their bottom line, if you like, then it can make the services they provide more sustainable. I think that is true, and also presumably makes them more able to take on additional routes where perhaps there wouldn't have been the commercial return. So in theory it may work that way, but it's really to try and safeguard and make more sustainable the routes which are currently there provided by the operators. And as you say, it has provided a windfall to a number of smaller operators and community transport providers as well, which is, I think, is a good thing.
Any figures on what, or I know you've got your official sitting beside you, have you got any sense of whether the changes have led to a reduction or an increase in the level of BSOG?
In the level of BSOG?
Well, how much the grant consumes in terms of public spending?
Well, it's a fixed budget, so although it was £50 million last year, we did provide an additional £10 million towards the end of the year. But so it is a fixed budget, and whatever the demands are, it won't exceed that budget. But I don't know if you want to say more about that, Tom.
I'm trying to get a sense of what the impact of the change has been.
Yeah, I mean, I think the budget is for the last year has been 50 million capped, and the same this year. Last year, that was a reduction in budget compared with the previous year, but it coincided with, as the Minister said, with a change in the formula for distribution. The result of that was that some operators, some of the larger, mainly urban operators, experienced a significant reduction in payments. But then about 75% or so of operators, we think, actually got more payments, higher payments than they would have had before the change in the formula. And that tended to benefit the operators who ran longer routes and or which tended to be in more rural areas, and I think probably explains some of the positive stories. There was also, I think, an extension of scope, although I'm not got the details to hand, in terms of Section 22 operators and demand responsive services, which shifted it. Overall, we think about £1.5 million or over £1.5 million in BSOG went to community transport organisations last year, out of a total of 50 million. And I think the figure in the CDA report, which I think is for the previous year, is about 2/3 So if you're looking at the sort of total volume of money going into the sector in BSOG, it actually went up substantially last year.
That's very helpful. Can I just ask the Minister finally, is there any scope for BSOG to be extended to cover community transport services not currently eligible? What would have to happen for that to...
Well, I think the budget is fixed. We've agreed the budget. So if you did that, you'd be taking it from other services. And of course, that could have a detrimental impact on the viability of some services. I think there's also the issue, though, if you make BSOG available more widely to community transport services, are you just talking about bus? I mean, community transport services obviously will include taxis and other services as well, so which would be very hard to see extended to that. It does come down to a function of who wins and who loses if you extend that. So to some extent, the 1.5 million, which has been mentioned by Tom, comes out of the budget, which would otherwise have gone to the existing operators. So I think, once again, I think it would be worth seeing what the committee's conclusions are in relation to that, but I wouldn't want to minimise the difficulties of extending BSOG to the full range of services provided by community transport providers.
Margaret, do you want to come in?
I'm just wondering if you have any conversation or communication with the NHS regarding community transport, because a lot of the evidence we heard was that community transport is used to transport patients to hospital appointments, etc. And that is costing them a lot of money, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of sort of payment from the NHS to community transport to recover these costs.
I think there are payments from the NHS to cover. I mean, in my own area, there are a number of services which go to the new hospital in Arbor, which are funded by the NHS, but they're under pressure as well, obviously, in terms of budget. But I'd mentioned at the start that I've had a number of discussions with Alec Neil in relation to this, and you've mentioned quite rightly patient transport, but there are a number of other organisations which deliver public services or volunteer services which use, by and large, minibuses which need drivers as well. So I think if at the base of your point is, can we try and work together with health and other partners to try and do this so that we maximise there are some vehicles that won't be being used as much as they could. There'll be some organisations which might be better off in terms of drivers, and there are some services which might run to and from the same place. So that was the purpose of having the doing the work which has been done just now with the health service to see how we can, and specifically myself and Alec Neil, to see how we can try and draw these together. It's to nobody's benefit if somebody, the public purse, is paying for a minibus that's sitting in a garage and not being used, or not being used as much as it could be. As against that, I've mentioned one example of where the health service is currently paying for services. There's something in the papers recently, I think, about services in Glasgow, which had extremely low take-up, and some had none at all, I think. I think it was in the Evening Times, for services run by, I think it was SPT. So that's obviously not in anybody's interest. I know they're doing work now to try and increase the awareness. I think part of the problem was that people didn't understand that the service was there, it was for free, so they didn't get on the bus where they might use the bus. So there's obviously an issue about making sure that people are aware of these services, but there's also the overriding one of trying to see to what extent, especially in rural areas, that one bus can perhaps cover more than one purpose or one group of users as well. So we are looking at that.
Okay. Minister, the previous administration ran the Rural Community Transport Initiative, and this government, I think in 2008, rolled that funding into local authority funding and expected the local authorities to honour the Scottish Government's ongoing funding commitments of the Rural Community Transport Initiative. Are you confident that local authorities have done that? And I think we heard in evidence that there was perhaps a desire from some people to see that funding centralised again rather than devolved to local authorities. Is that something that you've considered?
The government sometimes accused of centralising, so I'm not sure you'd want to do that again. And also the decision on a not ring fencing this, I think, was one which I'm confident about, that was the right one. And having come to the Parliament from a local authority background, I was, for my part, pretty fed up with all the different ring fencing and hypothecated grants that were awarded. So I think that was the right one. And I think the underlying principle was that local authorities had that discretion to use the resources. If they didn't do what was expected of them or what their local communities expect, then the remedy there is a democratic one. So, and also, having done some education roles in the past, I'm aware that there are different pockets of interest where they would like to see hypothecation for their area, but each one of those demands would eat away at the principle, I think, of democratic accountability, whereby we make the award to the councils. They're not like other organisations like health boards and so on. They've got their own democratic mandate, and I think they have to have that right. So it may be the case that there's not as much going into it in a local area as before, but then that's up to stakeholders to challenge that if that's the case. I don't think the remedy is for the government to go back in and say you must spend this much on this function.
Thanks. Gil?
Thanks very much, Convener. Morning, Minister. You mentioned the need for training in your opening statement, and the committee has taken some evidence from different parties with regards to D1 licence. It costs around about £1,000 to go through that element of the training. And I wondered if either local authorities or national authorities would consider assisting in that area to assist volunteers through that, if there's ways to assist them through that mechanism, maybe reducing the amount by provision of it. Maybe there's some programmes that local authorities and national authorities are engaged in that the voluntary sector can clip into, and so therefore reduce the costs.
Yeah, I think that is, there's no question it's possible to do that. Again, it would come back to funding, and as you mentioned, I've heard representations from those in the sector about just that fact, especially if it's a very small organisation. Trying to take on the provision of training can be a challenge for them, and to that extent there must at the very least, or the first step, be scope for more collaboration between different community transport providers to try and access that training. On the issue of the government providing support to reduce the cost to organisations, I think that is possible. I think again I would say that it would be useful to take a decision on that, having seen what the committee's conclusions are, because if we can get some sense of priority from the sector as to what it is, what support they want, I mean, it's not going to be possible, I think, to do all the things that they would want just in terms of finance. So, you know, adding to the concessionary travel scheme, additional money from BSOG, provision for vehicles and provision for training. I think to get a sense of what the most important priorities are from the sector through the work of the committee would be useful to see first before taking a decision on that.
I wasn't thinking so much, although I'm sure the committee would and the people in that sector would welcome additional money. I was thinking about more looking at the resources that are available now, and so that if there was, if we could collectively work with providers, so that those numbers that you could provide at a given time, it would reduce their costs by the numbers being there, and so that and if schemes were in place where the providers who are all private providers, I don't know of any public sector provision of this training. I'm unaware of that. So, but maybe they would take a more sanguine view if it was coming from the voluntary sector, and they may look at it in a different light by clipping them into a local authority training, but look at a reduced price. That's what I was looking for the government or local authorities to facilitate ways, mechanisms into training, on a kind of benefit basis.
I think that is, if that's a suggestion from the committee, we would want to look at that. I think the other thing is that if you provide the training on a larger scale, so that more people tap into it, you can help drive the cost down. But one of the constraints here would be the local nature of the services which are provided, the volunteer basis of the drivers and so on. But I think if that's a suggestion that comes from the committee, it would be very useful for us to be able to look at that.
And in the same area, the fact that it's a UK requirement for the D1 licence to be in place, I wondered if there's any dialogue between the Scottish Government and the UK Government, just looking particularly at this problem, and if there's something that could be done with the Department of Transport in that regard to try and find mechanisms again to assist the volunteering sector. We're not in it for money, but for the good of the community.
I think it would be difficult to convince the DFT to do that, but that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't try. So I'm trying to think whether we've made specific representations on that in the past. I can't bring to mind whether we have. But again, if that's a recommendation of the committee, and perhaps even in advance of that, there's no reason why the Scottish Government can't make representations to the DFT along those lines.
Thanks very much.
Okay, Gordon.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Wanted to move on to the subject of the National Concession Scheme, and Age Scotland, in collaboration with the Community Transport Association and others, have recently launched a Still Waiting campaign. Now, we also heard in evidence from John Berry of the Association of Transport Coordinating Officers, who said, "I do not think that the concessionary reimbursement scheme is the right fit for community transport." And we heard from John Moore of Lothian Community Transport Services, who stated it would not be practical for group travel under Section 19 to be part of the National Concessionary Fare Scheme. I'm just wondering what your view is on the Still Waiting campaign and their request for it to be extended to the National Concession Scheme.
Yeah, I mean, as I've said, I think I try to approach this with an open mind, but I think some of the practical difficulties, a number of which were laid out by Jim Eadie actually in the debate last week, are real difficulties, things like investment in the infrastructure, which is required if you're to be part of the National Concession Scheme, whether that's the right priority to be spending thousands of pounds on that infrastructure, the extent to which it could be used by the whole of the community transport sector, because it clearly couldn't with taxis and other vehicles that are there. It's going to be very difficult to do that. I do have the view, though, that we should really try and take an open mind to what Age Concern have said. I think they've also mentioned the fact that they recognise the budget pressures that this would give rise to, and have suggested that there should be a change to the eligibility, say from moving up through the pension age from 60. And I have to say that the government's view is that we don't intend to do that. We're sticking with the current eligibility rules, and the reason for that is we just think it's pretty tough times just now, especially for those on fixed incomes, and we don't want to withdraw that entitlement. So I would say that we've got a pretty fixed view on that we wouldn't want to change the eligibility criteria, which then leaves you to the idea that if you were to take in additional calls on the community concessionary travel scheme, that would be a straightforward addition to the budget in very constrained times. And there is perhaps more work to be done on what the actual cost of that would be. I've seen one figure of £11 million or so on. My view, and this was expressed last week again, the debate, is that as soon as you made that free, then the demand would start to increase anyway. So that figure is likely to increase. But having said that, I think the general approach of the campaign to try and see what further assistance can be provided is one that we want to have an open mind with, and in particular the issue where somebody cannot access other forms of transport because the bus service is not able to accommodate their requirements in terms of accessibility, and they would be entitled to have a concessionary fare, but they can't actually use it because they can't get. I think that is something that we've tried to look at already with some of the changes we've made, and I think it bears some further examination. So that part of it I think we are keen to look at further. But the extension of the scheme will cost more money, and we're not willing to cut back the entitlement to the scheme as it currently stands to try and make that part easier.
I mean, during the evidence we took, we heard about the cost of the high cost of the ticket machines, the reliability issues with them, the problem of attracting volunteers who were prepared to be trained in using the ticket machines. And I'm just wondering that, given that 2/3 of the vehicles used in community transport are private cars, and there are a range of local concession schemes operated by local authorities. We've got Aberdeenshire Council who support community transport. We've got Borders Council who have a taxi-based system, and we recently had Edinburgh Council talking about a tram scheme. If there's maybe more scope for local authorities to support the community transport sector.
I think that's definitely true. You mentioned Edinburgh with the tram scheme, but you could also see Glasgow with the subway as well. The concessions which they want to apply to those local transport systems, if I can put it that way, are I think best taken forward by them as well. And they also provide concessions where they choose to do so for rail services as well, and in some cases for ferry services. So I think that is right. And the first point you made about 2/3 being private cars shows you the difficulties of just trying to apply the concessionary travel scheme. And I would say that I wouldn't want the committee to form the impression, I'm sure they haven't got the impression anyway, that we are simply saying that the infrastructure for the National Concessionary Travel Scheme has to be used if we're to allow it to be accessed, if you follow what I mean. It's not just done there to be difficult. We have to have that infrastructure in place to keep the integrity of the system, and also to ensure that it's used for the right purposes. So I think it's really important that if we do extend the National Concessionary Scheme in any way, we have to have the ability to audit it, to make sure that only the right people can access it and so on. So that infrastructure is absolutely necessary, and it seems pretty clear to me that it would be very difficult to extend that infrastructure to private cars, for example, and things like that.
Okay, thanks so much.
Aileen, did you want to come in?
Yes, just on that issue, I mean, there does seem something fundamentally unfair that a 60-year-old in Edinburgh can use their concessionary bus pass to go to work, whereas an 80-year-old in a rural part of my constituency, or indeed probably your own, actually has the entitlement but can't use it because there's no service that they can access. If it's the case that the concessionary fare scheme is not the tool to address that lack of parity, are there other possibilities within preventative spend, within the change funds or whatever, maybe to be able to address that, do you think?
I couldn't speak for the change fund, but I realise why you mentioned that, because it's looking at preventative spend and spending across budgets, which can prevent greater spend overall. So I think there's no question in theory that could be done. And again, it would be useful to see what the committee's conclusions are in relation to how else those services could be supported. There's no question it can be done. I think I would accept that point, it can be done, but it'll be on the one hand how you can practically do that and ensure that the system has integrity, and on the other hand making sure you can make the funding available for it, I think.
Move on to your
Yeah,
question.
move on to the other question, yes. We took a certain amount of evidence about the difficulties that some community transport operators had in bidding for public contracts. Some seem to do it pretty well, actually, to the Coalfield Community Transport Organisation, which I visited, and Cumnock seemed to have actually a number of services it was running for the SBT. Is there a role actually in disseminating good practice, maybe through Transport Scotland and the Community Transport Association, and helping, providing training to community transport staff and helping them to bid for public contracts?
Yes, there is scope for that, and I think if, as in most other areas of public sector activity across the country, whoever's delivering it, the idea of best practice, you've mentioned Coalfields Regeneration, who are based in my constituency, that's where the headquarters are. If they're very good at it, then it is a question of how you can best disseminate that to others. I think it's also true to say that generally third sector business support schemes are already able to look at the voluntary sector, including community transport providers, on public sector contracting, which has been made much more straightforward with the portal which has been established. But there's no question that we could also look at how we could help CTA to ensure that the sector is able to make best use of the opportunities. So I think there is scope to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Minister, the government currently supports the Community Transport Association to fund its activities. I think it's one full-time officer and a part-time admin assistant. Is there a possibility that we could increase that funding to allow community transport to provide additional services to its Scottish members?
I think, again, that would be another demand, and it would be useful to see how that is prioritised amongst the other demands in terms of community transport. And you could only take a decision on that when you saw what the other priorities were. But of course it's possible to do that, but the main reason for it being difficult is a general situation in terms of public sector budgets. We support a great many organisations, and I think given the fixed nature of the budget, supporting one to a greater extent will usually mean not supporting another. So it is possible to do that, and I think we have had representations from CTA in relation to that in the past as well. But again, I would say that we think we've provided a fair settlement for CTA. We continue to support them. If there was to be increased funding, it would be best to look at that in the context of the other recommendations of the committee, I think.
Anyone got any final questions to the Minister on this subject? Okay, thank you very much. I'll briefly suspend the meeting to allow a changeover of your supporting officials, Minister. Thank you, Mr Davey. Agenda item 2 is a transport update. We'll hear evidence again from the Minister of Transport and Veterans as part of a more general committee update around transport matters. So can I welcome you again, Minister, and your supporting official, Aidan Griesward, Director of Rail of the Scottish Government. Minister, would you like again to make a brief opening statement?
Thank you, Convener. It's a fairly wide-ranging subject area, so if I could mention some of the areas which might anticipate some of the questions. Over the period since 2007, the Government's invested about £8.3 billion in the transport systems, making good, I believe, on the sustained underinvestment in previous years. During 2012-2015, £5.4 billion of investment has been allocated for transport infrastructure and services to deliver on our strategic transport objectives. First of all, we invest to create employment and to stimulate growth. We invest to create conditions of advantage and opportunity. We invest to allow businesses access to a skilled workforce and to deliver goods and services to markets. And we invest also so that people are able to move freely for work, education and leisure. In relation to ferries, ferries are essential to Scotland's transport network. They provide a vital link to our remote and island communities. And at the end of last year, as you know, we published our ferries plan, which contained a number of proposals to further enhance ferry services for the benefit of local communities. Despite what are very harsh cuts made by the UK Government to our capital budgets over a quarter, we've continued to invest in vessels and shoreside infrastructure. The MV Lochinvar, a cutting-edge ferry which is the second of two unique hybrid vessels, was launched on the Clyde on the 23rd of May at Ferguson's shipyard in Port Glasgow, and its sister ship MV Hallaig is due to come into service later this summer. And I'm very proud for my part that we're providing record levels of financial support to underline our commitment to ensuring that all communities, be they remote, island or mainland, share in Scotland's future success. In relation to bus, which we've just been talking about, our commitment to bus services, I think, is demonstrated by the £250 million of support provided every year for the Bus Service Operators Grant and concessionary fares. And again, that's against a backdrop of these services, these support mechanisms diminishing in other parts, most of the parts of the UK. Statutory quality partnerships have been established across 5 local authority areas, and these partnerships help to create opportunities for authorities to specify the quality of buses and minimum frequencies. And in return for that, the authorities concerned, local authorities or RTPs, undertake to improve the infrastructure. And for our part, the Scottish Government seeks to encourage that type of approach. And we launched in April the Bus Investment Fund, which will provide around £3 million this year to support local initiatives. In addition to that investment, we're committed to the National Concessionary Travel Scheme, as I've mentioned, for older people and disabled people living in Scotland. We reached the agreement in January for the next 2 years, which will secure those services. The agreement provides, as I've said, fair reimbursement. It wasn't a figure plucked out of the air, and I've seen some commenting locally that suggests this is a cut. Now, obviously, it's a reduction in the reimbursement rate, but it's not just plucked out there by the Scottish Government. It's worked out by consultants as being a fair rate, and that was accepted by bus operators, although I wouldn't deny the fact they would like to see a higher rate. Transport Scotland are using the experience of the smart ticketing systems installed on over 7,000 buses to inform the significant challenges faced in extending smart ticketing to other transport modes in future, and to work towards that long-term vision of all journeys in Scotland's bus, rail, ferry, subway and tram networks being accessed by some form of smart ticketing or payment. In relation to the trams, currently our second largest infrastructure project, now making good progress with the support of Transport Scotland, and remains on schedule to begin passenger services by summer next year. In relation to railways, we had a debate on this last week in the Parliament, but we understand that railways are more than a means to move people and goods. They can spread prosperity, generate economic activity, strengthen communities and create business and leisure opportunities, and we are determined to deliver a modern and efficient rail network that's a source of pride and puts the needs of passengers at its heart. I mentioned last week that we have more than 83 million passengers per year travelling on ScotRail services, which is a remarkable growth of around a third over the past decade. And we're continuing our investment in better stations, better trains, services, and will support further growth. We announced a £5 billion programme in June last year for the period 2014 to 2019, and that includes £3 billion of capital investment in the rail infrastructure, supporting substantial improvements between Edinburgh and Glasgow, between Aberdeen and Inverness, on the Highland Main Line and future electrification projects. We've committed to the development of community rail partnerships in Scotland for the first time, aiming to build on existing successful community involvement schemes such as ScotRail's Adopt a Station, which was mentioned last week as well in the debate. And we're progressing well with the reletting of the 2 franchises from April 2015. The sleeper contract is likely to be in excess of £200 million, with the ScotRail franchise being the single biggest contract let by the Scottish Government, with a cost in excess of £2.5 billion. In relation to roads, we're delivering the new Forth Crossing, Scotland's biggest infrastructure project in a generation. It is currently on budget and on time. The Forth Road Bridge Bill passed Stage 3 on Thursday, 23rd of May. And you may wish to note that the Forth Bridges Forum website went live on Monday the 20th of May. I know this has been discussed at this committee before, in conjunction with the launch of the consultation on the World Heritage Site application in respect of the Forth Bridge. Currently, the people of Scotland are having their say on the name of the new crossing. I know that other countries are looking in and paying attention to how we're trying to engage with individuals and communities. The first time it's been done, I think, on that scale in Scotland. There are 2 days left. If anybody's not voted, voting closes on the 7th of June. The public still has the opportunity to influence and be part of an historic process by logging on to www.namethebridge.co.uk, which I see was actually mentioned in the leader column of the Scotsman today, so wider circulation than I can give it. Just under a year ago, we set out our plans to dual the A9 between Perth and Inverness by 2025. On the 28th of May, Transport Scotland hosted the Industry Day in Perth to inform representatives from 26 consultancy companies about business opportunities available through their ambitious £3 billion programme. Transport Scotland are also currently holding a series of public exhibitions to update the public on how we have been progressing various strands of the A9 dualling work. And I would encourage everyone with an interest to come along to one of the venues and comment on the developing programme. For example, today's venues in Kincraig Community Hall and tomorrow in Burnham Arts and Conference Centre. Transport and the RPP2, the Government's committed over £200 million over the current spending review period to support climate change action by reducing the carbon impact of transport. That's via active travel, low carbon vehicles and congestion reduction. And that's a very good record of investment in the future of transport in Scotland. Those proposals have been scrutinised by the Parliament and stakeholders, and I would thank the committee for their inputs. The Government's now carefully considering those representations and recommendations made during the process as it works to finalise the report, which is expected to be published in the summer. So I hope, Convener, that's a brief overview of the key highlights of the past 6 months, and it's helpful to the committee, and I look forward to trying to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Minister. You mentioned both the Caledonian Sleeper and ScotRail franchising processes briefly. Can you maybe expand on that a bit and tell us exactly where we are, an update on where we are with both processes?
This is the point at which I'm very grateful that the sole official that's with me is a rail official, but I did provide something of an update last week in the rail debate to say that the sleeper process, we're now down to 4 bidders for that process. There was, I think it's fair to say, a degree of scepticism as to whether we would get that level of interest from others, not from ourselves, but so we're very pleased to have 4, which is probably the optimum. 3 or 4 is the optimum number of bidders for that service. It is a new thing to have done, and it is a smaller franchise, one of the smallest there'll be, so it is encouraging to see that level of interest. You may remember that we did keep the option open of putting that franchise back into the main franchise had we not had that level of interest, but we're very pleased to have that. And the process for the ScotRail franchise, which also explains why we've staggered the 2, is ongoing, is going well. I think the one thing we'd say is that we've been very keen to incorporate any lessons from the Brown and Laidlaw reviews which have taken place because of the West Coast Main Line situation. And that means there's a great deal of care being taken just now as we go through the process, but it's currently on schedule and we're happy with the process so far. I don't know if you want to add anything, Aidan?
No, I suppose other than just to, in terms of the key dates going forward, we've obviously got the responses back on the PQQ and sleep that the Minister mentioned, but in terms of the main ScotRail franchise, they must to issue the PQQ in July to start the process on the main ScotRail franchise.
And on the Caledonian Sleeper, when would you expect that to be awarded?
The award date will be May.
Of this year?
2014 will be the actual...
May 2014?
Yeah.
Okay, and the ScotRail franchising, current franchise was extended. What kind of timetable are you looking at?
It wasn't so much extended as we used some of the contingency period which is allowed under the contract, so that goes through until mid-2015.
Yeah.
Elaine, you wanted to ask some questions on
Yes,
ferries?
just a couple of updates on ferries. First on the HM Hamnavoe, that is fully operational again.
Yes.
Yeah, we went back to service on the 23rd of May, did it?
It was the Thursday of that week.
Yeah. Serco Northlink obviously provided a service for freight, but only a very limited one for passengers. And passengers had to be accommodated by Pentland Ferries operating additional services. Has Serco Northlink been able to provide any explanation as to why they weren't able to provide a replacement vessel which would accommodate freight and passengers?
Well, I should say that all the passengers seeking to make that journey were accommodated by Pentland Ferries, and quite a number on the freight vessel which you mentioned, which took the bulk of the freight. Sometimes it meant that people's vehicles had to be transported by one and they themselves were transported by the other, but the capacity was there to meet that demand. And we were aware of that capacity being there when the contract was let in the way that it was. The specific reasons given by Serco, but not just by Serco, because we didn't just leave it to Serco to look for an additional vessel. We asked CMAL, CalMac and others as well to see what vessels are available. The reasons given were, first of all, it was a very short-term lease, so it wasn't attractive to a lot of people to provide a vessel from other parts of the world for that short-term lease. And also because there's been a substantial reduction in tonnage that's available in any event because of the recession throughout the world. And even beyond that, if you'd wanted to take a vessel from a distant part of the world, which is a possibility, then by the time it got here, then we'd hope to have the Ham Naboo up and running as it subsequently transpired. But those are the main reasons that were given.
In terms of the costs of the disruption for the buses and the extra Pentland Ferries sailings, were those all met by Serco, or did the Scottish Government have to foot the bill for any of that?
We've not footed the bill for anything. Serco, in addition to being penalised for the sailings which weren't undertaken, although it gets a bit more complex when they were providing sailings, but not, if you like, optimum sailings because it was a freight service. We have to work through things with them. So they had to pay for that. They also had to pay around £500,000 for the replacement of the crankshaft which went, but no, the services and the additional integration through buses were paid for by Serco.
Was a penalty imposed on Serco by Transport?
We haven't actually come to the final figure, but yes, it's around about £7,000 each time they didn't provide the sailing that was required.
Can I ask you about the study which Transport Scotland commissioned into the impact of the removal of RET from the Western Isles for commercial vehicles or larger commercial vehicles from the Western Isles, Coll and Tiree? That MVA consultancy report suggested there had in fact been some negative impact on the economies of those islands through the removal of ferry fares for commercial vehicles, and made a number of suggestions regarding fare schemes which might mitigate some of the negative impacts. I wondered really, could you maybe elucidate a bit more about the findings of the research and how the Scottish Government's considering taking those forward?
Yeah, I think we're still looking at the outcome of the research and listening to other stakeholders about it. But we had said before the study was undertaken that we want, as part of the ferries plan, if you remember, that we wanted to get to a situation where freight fares across Scotland were consistent and rational and intelligible and fair, because what had existed before, and to some extent still does, is a very complex mixture of fares, freight fares, which the origins and rationale, if there was ever a rationale for them, were lost in the mists of time. So what we will use the study for is to make sure that we get to that position where we have across Scotland a fair freight policy. And this survey obviously helps us to do that with the findings of the survey, but that was our overall intention in any event.
Who are you consulting with in terms of that?
Well, we're looking at, we've had the consultants' report, so that's come back to us now. We've had the representations and it's been taken forward. We're evaluating that just now. I think from memory, the ferries plan which we produced undertook a huge amount of consultation, so we have the information back from stakeholders, and it may be that the people in Transport Scotland are looking at it will take on additional assistance with that as well, but I don't know the detail of that.
Alex, did you have a short?
I wanted to ask for a little more detail on one of the previous questions there in relation to the time when the Ham Naboo wasn't in service. The reliance to some extent on Pentland Ferries, is it the case, did Pentland Ferries receive any direct support during that period, or were they simply charging the normal fares that they would have charged for passengers using that service?
Certainly didn't receive any support from the Scottish Government. It's a as you know, a privately run service.
Yes.
What they got was, though, as has been mentioned by in response to the previous question, the additional bus services that went to their terminal rather than going to Serco's were provided at the expense of Serco. And also Serco's systems were changed very quickly so that people were being directed towards Pentland ferries. There was other options as well. If you wanted to travel from Aberdeen, you could do that, obviously. So, no, the assistance that was provided really was, if you like, a boost to their business because they were taking far more passengers, and that was made as easy as possible, but they received no direct financial support from the government.
I was just interested in the fact that what is essentially a subsidised service for a while was being provided by an unsubsidised contractor, and I wondered if any lessons were learned there for the long term.
Well, I think when we established the contract, I mean, Pentlands Ferries has been there for some time. You have to take into account what the possibilities are for a crossing. We said that the Scrabs or Stromness route was a lifeline service. We said that in response to the representations we had from stakeholders, and I think that's right. But I don't think there's any downside to the fact that the public and the private sector seem to collaborate very effectively to meet the needs of passengers, and I think that's no bad thing.
Thank you.
Alex, do you want to go on to your question?
My shot next, is it? I wanted to ask the Minister about road developments, some of which he's touched on already. In doing that, very impressed with the work that has now been achieved with the M74 and the M80 extensions. And the contribution that has made to our road network. I wonder if the Minister might be able to give me updates on one or two other projects. First of all, the M8 completion.
Well, all I can say really is that we're at the stage of the process that we expect it to be. So we've had a huge interest from the industry. We had an industry day in Glasgow which was brimming at the seams, absolutely packed out the hall. And that's been taken forward. So there's the work that was expected to be done at this stage has been done. There's no change to the timeline on that. I can get you more detail if you like on exactly what's happening right now, but it's proceeding as it was planned to do.
The Minister's already mentioned the dualling of the A9. I wondered if it would be possible to get slightly more information on current expectations in relation to timescale for that project.
Well, we've laid out the fact that we want to have it completed, fully dualled by 2025. There are a number of projects which will be taken forward well in advance of that. There are sometimes a kind of shorthand critique of it which says that we have to wait until 2025, but the truth of it is that many sections of that road will be completed long before then, so benefits will be felt progressively along the road. I think there's 3 particular sections which are much more advanced than the rest of the route just now. And once again, that's proceeding as we expected it to do. The contracts which I mentioned before were design contracts, so we're asking companies to come forward for their proposals for the design, and that in itself actually will provide the successful bidders with about 12 years worth of work on that project. So it's progressing such that we can get it done by 2025, but as I say, you'll see substantial progress and sections being completed well before that.
Moving slightly closer to home for me, the obstacles appear to be gone from the AWPR. Is it possible for the Minister to give an update on where the AWPR project is at the moment?
Well, immediately after this committee, my way to go and see another one of the obstacles being removed, which is the international school, which is about to be demolished. That starts today. As you know, that was a part of the route, so that has to be done, and the new school's been established. The work that's been ongoing just now is mainly ground investigations, just to make sure that the parts that we couldn't get into before, we could only go so far with the legal process. We're now making sure the rest of that is done. Once again, we had an extremely good infrastructure day. We have a short lead of bidders now for that project. So it is going, I think it's not just going according to schedule, because the schedule, my view is this should have been done many years ago, but it's going as fast as it possibly can, I think, given the fact that we had to wait for the outcome of the legal process. And today we'll see further evidence of that with the demolition of the school.
When will we see actual construction work or excavation begin?
Construction rather than destruction, which we're going to see today, I suppose. I think the timescales, we've got the minimum awards, the award contract is autumn next year, so it could be very quickly after that you start to see other works on the ground. There'll be work happening in the meantime as well, but so we've had the Industry Day in January, and it had to be put in the official journal of the European Union, obviously. The invitation to tender has gone out, so we expect autumn next year, the award of the contract and the start of the works.
And of course, these projects can vary according to a number of factors, including weather. But when might we see the first car run on the AWPR?
Well, as we said before, 2018 is our target. There has been a lot of discussion about whether particular sections might be done in advance of others, and we are looking at that as well. And obviously the discussion with bidders just now is also looking at that. For example, people have asked whether Balmedy Tipperty could be done. It seems a discrete piece of the routes could be done in advance, and that's been looked at. Also, some of the pressures around the airport, whether that could be looked at sympathetically. So, but as for the whole route, 2018 is what we've said.
The latest roads project announced by the government was the dualling of the A96. And I'm interested in that project in particular. My first question is a simple one, and that is, why has the government chosen to dual the full length of the A96 rather than simply the Inverness to Nairn section that was proposed in the Strategic Projects Review?
I think the most obvious reason is that we do have a position of believing that all Scotland's cities should be connected by a dual carriageway or a motorway. From my view, that's a kind of basic requirement of a modern developed economy. And if we hadn't done that, that would have been the only part between two cities that wasn't dualled or made motorways. So I think it's right that we have, if we're going to do that level of work anyway, I think it's right that we do the whole thing. And as you mentioned before, the A9 dualling hadn't featured in the STPR, but once we've taken that decision to say we want to connect, in that case, Perth and Inverness would be to the cities. If we take that decision, then I think it would be anomalous for us not to have done the same on the A96. I think it's right we have that level of road there.
I presume that there has been a business case prepared for dualling the A96. Will that be published?
I'd have to check on that, because some business cases, our normal practice is to do that. For example, I've said to the committee we'll produce a business case in relation to the Edinburgh to Glasgow high-speed line. So whether elements of it are held back for commercial confidentiality, I'm not saying they are, I just can't remember at this point. But
for example, is there a cost-benefit analysis applied to that?
Yeah, I mean, just as with the AWPR.
We're likely to be able to see that at some point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If we go back to the WPR Minister, is one of the other obstacles the current stance of Aberdeen City Council, where they say that the council shouldn't be honouring its agreement made way back, I think in 2003, of the amount that Aberdeen City Council should be paying for the project, and comparing it with the Forth Crossing, which I think is completely irrelevant. But what's your view on Aberdeen City Council's current stance?
Well, I would say that only somebody who had been ignorant of the process that had been developed could make that accusation, given the fact this was agreed, I think, back in 2003, the actual split of the costs. And prior to that point, of course, it had been a local road project. It was one which was brought forward by, I think, Grampian Regional Council, or its successor councils. So this was a local project which the previous executive agreed it would take on an element for, and they worked out a ratio, 81% to 19% split between the two councils, which was agreed. And it's subsequently been agreed in January this year by Aberdeen Council. The approach of Aberdeenshire Council has been quite different, of course. When I went up to see the site of part of the AWPR a couple of weeks ago, Aberdeenshire Council representative said to me, a deal's a deal, let's get on with it. The approach of Aberdeen City Council was quite different. They've not just happy with the cap which we provided, which limits their contribution, they've tried to talk away from the deal which was previously agreed. And whether that will continue after present democratic battles are fought, I don't know. But it seems to me that it's an act of good faith. If you agree to something, agree to it twice, that you don't then try to reopen the whole thing. And I think there was a danger, probably less so now, that that uncertainty which was created by that also has an impact on the process for the road itself. It affects the confidence of bidders. I think it was regrettable that we had that, and hopefully it's died away now.
Okay, and you mentioned perhaps some pinch points like Balmedi, Tipperty and around the airport. Do you envision the AWPR being done in sections, or is it going to start at the north and work its way round, or how do you envisage the work being done?
I think what we've done is listen to representations from local people and very valid, legitimate representations. But what we have to do is try and talk to the bidders and see what they think, the experts that will actually construct the road. Is it possible to do a section in a particular time scale? I don't think we're hidebound by saying that we have to start at point A and finish at point B. There is obviously scope to do it in a different way, but our ability to do that and to answer that those legitimate demands for earlier work, we really have to get the views of those that will be constructing the road.
Jim, do you want to ask some questions about active travel?
Yes, thank you, Convener. When you appeared before the Committee Minister in December of last year, I asked you about the refresh of the Cycling Action Plan for Scotland. I wonder if today you could provide an update on the refresh of the plan, including a timescale for its publication, and can you confirm that it will contain interim targets and that it will be fully aligned with RPP2?
I think on the first point, which precludes me answering your second point about interim targets, obviously the plan has to come out. There has to be a further discussion, I think, it's within government just now, and we're looking at it just now, and we have to talk to our local authority partners, so we'll be talking to COSLA about it as well. And it's at that point that we'll be able to announce exactly what's in the caps.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to know that it's at an advanced stage, but publication does seem to have slipped a little. I'm not overly concerned about that, because I think if we get the document right, that's more important than having it rushed. But can you provide the clarity on the timescale?
I think I'm just trying to, I know we're trying to establish a date for the discussion with COSLA, Councillor Stephen Hagan just now, and that would be the final part of the process once we have the discussion between ourselves and COSLA. And I think it's worth mentioning that because a lot of the discussion about the background to CAPS has been about the Scottish Government, and CAPS, as I'm sure you're aware, is a collaborative document. It's not just the Scottish Government's, and also the work that we're doing on active travel, cycling, walking and so on is one which is done in many ways by local authorities and local partnerships. So we have to have that agreement first. I think it's either at I'd have to check, but it's either the beginning of the recess or during the recess that I'm hoping to meet with COSLA and get it signed off then.
Okay, thank you for that. You'll be aware of the recent demonstration organised by Pedal on Parliament outside the Parliament, some 4,000 cyclists from across the country. I understand you met recently with representatives of this grassroots organisation. Can you update us on any outcomes from the meeting?
Yes, although yes, I can update you on what we discussed. For example, things like 20 mile an hour zones, which I know you're well aware of. I did make the point that these are matters for local authorities to take forward. Local authorities are in the main of the roads where they would be seeking to have a 20 mile an hour zone, and I understand the desire for that. I didn't agree with the demand for a wholesale change to 20 mile an hour roads. I do think it has to be done by local authorities, and we have seen work being undertaken in Edinburgh City Council, which we've said that we will try and, with Edinburgh City Council, make available to other areas of Scotland so they can take that on. We also discussed cycling safety. We discussed at some length the situation in the Netherlands, and I'm going to the Netherlands next week to see exactly what they've done. Sorry?
On to that.
Well, so we're going there next week. There was quite a lot of discussion. They made the point, I think a very good point, which was that people hold the Netherlands up as an excellent example of how to accommodate cycling, but they didn't achieve that overnight, and they also made, as would be expected, a number of mistakes which they've since rectified, and that the Scottish Government and its partners should learn from the fact that some of the mistakes which were made. They also made, again, a very reasonable point. It was better to do less, but to do it very effectively and properly, than it was to do a lot and get it wrong. Perhaps an obvious point, but they'd seen that from their experience We also discussed the issue of liability. We don't agree on the question either of a criminal liability or civil liability. We don't agree with that position, so we don't intend to take that forward. We did, as was required under the previous caps, investigate what the situation had been in other countries, and we're not able to make that correlation between liability and improved safety. So we don't intend to take that forward. That was a point of difference between us. Other than that, I think we had a very constructive discussion, which will end up with me even more on a bicycle in the future weeks and months, and also about how we could look at how more of the transport budget was to be allocated to that in future years. So I think it was my view of it, and you'd have to ask Pedal on Parliament people for their view, was it was constructive, and it's opened up perhaps a wider discussion about how we try to achieve more in future.
I think the final point you made about funding, it was a point that was made by Graham Aubrey at Pedal on Parliament, was that this is not funding, this is investment, and that the amount of money which the National Health Service would save in the reduction in levels of obesity, cardiovascular disease, stroke and so on is a huge benefit for the whole country. Was that something that was discussed?
Yes, I think in general terms it was, and I think I made the point, it was either at that meeting or a very similar meeting, where that is often said across a whole range of government expenditure. If you invest more here, you'll make savings. I think the point I've tried to make is that just now, I can't remember a time when public finances were as constrained as they are now. So it's finding that money in the first place. And the point, as you know, that Pedal on Parliament would make is they'd like to see a bigger slice of the transport budget allocated towards that. I've laid out what our priorities have been in terms of the other transport projects that we're involved in, and I do think there is an extent to which we're trying to make good on many years of underinvestment, so that again adds to the pressure which is there. But I do accept the point there are real gains to be made, especially, I should have mentioned, perhaps the biggest part of the discussion was about how we might increase the amount of commuting journeys undertaken by cycling or active travel. We're considering this in relation to the next franchise as well, so that, say for example, people focus on getting more bicycles on trains, but we're trying to focus on things like how in the Netherlands, for example, you can take your bike to the train station, you can have it somewhere secure, you can have it repaired whilst you're away on your train journey elsewhere. You can pick up a bike at the other end to complete your journey, so the entire journey can be either public or active transport. So we're looking at that, and I think trying to identify the most commonly used pathways where lots of commuting takes place to see how we can drive down the amount used by cars in particular. And that, I think our discussion talked about how we can do that in collaboration with local authority partners, so that if you had an agreed, I don't want to give an example, I did give one at the meeting, but an agreed place where you had a terminal for buses or trains, and you had another place, say a mile or two away, which was a major centre of employment, the part in between could be maintained to an extent, you know, whether it was, if you wanted to encourage people to walk there, that the lighting was better, especially for those that felt vulnerable in dark areas. The roads, the maintenance of the roads would be different, the signage and so on as well. So actually creating commuting pathways was one of the things that we discussed, which I'm very keen that we take further.
And did you have any discussion about what level of investment would be required to take that idea forward?
No, well, there was a demand obviously from Pedal on Parliament for the level of investment that they'd want to see, but what I've said was about how constrained resources were, also the extent to which we're spending. I think the figures were since 2007, I'd have to check this exactly, we had spent around £70 million compared to the previous 5 years, which had been around £58 million. So we have increased it. They would like to see much more in future years. So we did discuss how we could increase it over future years, but I wouldn't say we came to an agreement. We're continuing to discuss it. I think it's the best way to characterise it.
Okay, and your trip to the Netherlands, what are you hoping to gain from that? Well,
an understanding of the infrastructure that's used there. I think there is a different culture, if I can put it that way, in terms of cycling usage. How they calm traffic, I think there's been, I've certainly heard it second hand that it's very often just a perception when you move into urban areas about the nature of the environment that you're in, that it calms the traffic down, and it can be done in very subtle ways. So to get a better understanding of that, but also in relation to how they integrate between different services, rail and cycle, for example. But I'm open-minded and keen to see what I can whilst I'm there.
Yeah, and we have the Danish and Dutch cycle embassies exist to disseminate the good practice which there is in other European countries. We're quite a long way off from the day when we'd have a Scottish cycle embassy.
I think just now what we're doing is talking to people in Denmark and Spain and trying to learn the lessons of what they've done there. I think it's also true to say that not everything is transferable across. We have different climates, different topographies as well, but we are talking to people in Spain and Denmark to make sure we also learn lessons from there too.
Can I ask you just one final question? The Parliament in March 2012 supported the idea of 100% of children being able to access on-road cycle training by 2015. Is that something that you're looking at?
Yes, I think we made an announcement last year about additional funding for that, and the distinction that you've made between cycling training, which has happened in schools up till now, which is in a playground, is quite different from on the road training. I'd have to check exactly where we're at with getting to that target with you, but we provided additional funding for that last year to increase the number of people that get on the road training. And the reason why it's crucial is if we're wanting to reassure and encourage parents to allow their children to go to school, for example, on a bike, that they have to have some level of confidence in the ability of their children to do that. And on the road training is quite distinct from, you know, cycle proficiency, for example, in a playground. I can get the figures of where we're at with that back to you, but we have taken that on board, and that's what we want to see.
Can I ask you to provide an update following on from that on the National Walking Strategy?
Yeah, I'd have to just check. Which one is it? We're working on that with Paths for All. The latest I'd seen in that was that the work that's been done has been going extremely well. We have a further meeting coming up with those involved in active travel, where we can see how that progresses. But it's pretty much as it was planned, and the deadline that we've given is to be met. I'd have to check and give you the figures on that, Convener.
Margaret, would you like to ask your question on rail Wi-Fi?
Can you give me an update on the rollout of Wi-Fi on ScotRail trains and also in the stations, including as well, if possible, an indication of plans to extend coverage to all rolling stock and stations that can obviously be reasonably fitted by Wi-Fi equipment?
Yeah, I'll maybe ask Aidan to come in this as well, but we have fitted or are fitting the 380 service, which is going out to Ayrshire by and large, but across the network as well. We are, the most recent announcement was about the 170 trains, which are to be fitted, and a number of stations. Once those two sets of rolling stock have been fitted, that will comprise around 1/3 of the network that we have in terms of rolling stock. In relation to the stations which have announced, what we've done is, it has to be done in a phased way. It's only way that it can be done both in practical terms and financial terms, given the constraints that we have. But what we focused on in relation to the stations which have announced were things like footfall was one part of it, but also how long people tend to spend in a particular station, and also we had an eye on those access points for the Commonwealth Games as well. So that's why we've prioritised what we've done so far, but the ultimate aim is to achieve complete coverage. I don't know if you want to say some more on that, Aidan.
Yeah, just other than also in terms of fitment of 170 stock, that's on schedule for the end of this year, and then as the Minister said, fitment of 380s beyond that into the following year, and then it's part of the franchise specification, a commitment for rollout across all the railway, with a backstop date of 2019, but with an expectation that, you know, substantial progress we made in the early part of the franchise period. It's not just a question of fitment of the actual stock, indeed stations, it's also just the signal strength that you get in particular areas. So obviously needs to be a good bit of work around how that integrates with the overall Wi-Fi coverage across Scotland as a whole. So that's something that's been looked into.
Thank you.
Gordon, do you want to come in on this?
Can I just ask a quick question on that? The Wi-Fi that's available on stations or on the rolling stock, is that completely free, or is it only a short window of time that it's free? Because I'm hearing from colleagues that it's a 15-minute window and then there's a charging period.
East Coast, which is we're not responsible for, neither West Coast, obviously, mainline services, but the ones which we have are all free. There can be a limit in terms of the capacity, but there's no point at which you charge for anything that you receive now.
Right, okay, thanks.
Gordon, do you want to ask your question?
My own question's about the Borders Railway. I understand the Borders Railway project recently entered its construction phase. Given that it's a 30-mile route and requires a number of bridges to be built or rebuilt, are there any indications at this stage that the route will not come in on time and on budget, and when do you anticipate the route opening?
What we've said is, in relation to the timing, is that Network Rail are saying to us that they think somewhere, I think September 2015 is the date that they can confidently anticipate being completed by. What we said when we awarded the contract to Network Rail was we wanted to make sure that we further explored any opportunities for bringing that forward. They were understandably a bit reluctant, given some of the uncertainties, for example, mine workings, which have been undertaken. We expect, I think it's at the end of the summer, to be able to sit down with Network Rail again and say, what have you found from your ground investigations, what have you found from the mine workings. If you travel along the route just now, you'll see a huge amount of work going on the route. And obviously they're getting more information as they do this, they'll get more certainty about timescale. So the ability to pull that back in from the current timescale we'll not know about until the end of the summer. Then we should have a clearer idea.
Okay, thanks.
Gil?
Thanks very much. I know that Chris Gibb of Virgin Trains, the Chief Operating Officer, he made comment on the Scotland to London route, and he's saying that if a combination of the West Coast upgrade took place and the planned high-speed rail link to London was combined, that it would be a time of 3 hours and 15 minutes that would be projected for that, and that's without a journey from the end of the northern stop to Scotland. In other words, no upgrade at all for Scotland. And I wondered if you would like to comment on the feasibility of that or the worthiness of it.
Virgin have had this position for some time that they think there are substantial improvements in journey time which could be made without a high-speed line coming straight to Scotland, and we've listened to what they've had to say, and I think if there are any ways in which we can improve journey times in advance of a high-speed link to Scotland, then we should certainly explore that. But we don't accept the point that Scotland should not have its own high-speed rail link. I think also the UK government, Patrick McLaughlin, I think, has made the statement that he wants to see sub-3 hour journey times Scotland to London. I'm interested to find out more about how he thinks that will be achieved. I can't imagine how it would be achieved, even given what Chris Gibbs said, without the full high-speed line. But so we're in discussions with the Westminster government just now about how we can take forward proposals for a high-speed rail link to Scotland, and we've announced our proposals to have a high-speed rail link between Edinburgh and Glasgow to accommodate and encourage that move. Also, it's true to say that if you took the current position of the UK government that they've only announced the limited line that they have, and that should be done by, I think, 2032, we anticipate, and I think most people in the industry agree, that a substantial upgrade to the West Coast Main Line without the high-speed link will have to happen by around the mid-2020s, because the capacity will be such that it will be exceeded, and there will be real issues with both freight, I think, and passenger services on that line. So that, to me, just makes it perfectly common sense to say, let's do the whole thing and start it now, go right the way up to Scotland. We have virtual unanimity. There are still people that don't think that high-speed rail link is the way to go, but virtual unanimity in Scotland between the trade unions, the business organisations, ourselves, Civic Scotland, through the partnership that we have, that we want to have high-speed rail come to Scotland. So if there are interim benefits to be had from some of the suggestions by Virgin, and of course we should look at those, but I don't think we should take our eye off the ball from saying Scotland needs, deserves, and will benefit from, and the UK will massively benefit from coming to Scotland. I think the business case, the cost-benefit ratio is a certain degree for what the company propose. It's massively better if it comes to Scotland, and that is also where you'll start to see substantial modal shift, where people can make a train journey that will take 3 hours or less, rather than going to Heathrow or Gatwick. It'll take substantially longer. So it makes sense for them to proceed that way. And whilst what Chris Gibbs says is interesting, and it might provide some scope for interim improvements, it's not a substitute for high-speed rail.
This time that Chris Gibb has mentioned, so that we can get an idea of what the difference would be, have you got an indication what the likely time would be if the journey did come from London straight up to Scotland? What's the difference between the 3 hours, 15 minutes and compared to the direct route?
I mentioned Patrick McLaughlin's target of sub 3 hours. That's always what we understood we could achieve through high-speed rail, but perhaps Aidan would want to come in on that.
Yeah, I mean, we'll sit down with Chris Gibb just to find out more about, the 3 hours 15 claim and what that consists of. Also, we need to distinguish also between the direct end-to-end journey times from a non-stop service and a stopping service that's similar to what we have now. So there's trade-offs around all of that too. But like the Minister said, we're keen to understand what can be done in terms of incremental improvements in the meantime, and understand the basis of the 3 hours 15 endpoint too.
You raise a question that I never even thought about there, that this 3 hours 15 minutes, this is not including any stoppages in between.
Well,
this is a journey time then.
That's what we need to clarify. Yeah. Certainly the objectives around the 4 hour journey time in a shorter timetable on the basis of a non-stop. I think it's 3 hours 59, so it's non-stop service between London and Glasgow. So we just need to talk through Chris about what exactly the service
That's
is.
extremely important, because I did realise that the figure that was mentioned in other places, that it was sub 3 hours, and I'm thinking, well, what's the difference between maybe it's 2 hours and 59 minutes compared to 3 hours and 15 minutes, and the amount of money that would be involved in that. But so we need to be in a position to compare apples with apples and not with pears. So that would be useful information. But back to the bit that's under your control, Minister, or perhaps some of it is under your control, and perhaps you could give us an update with regards to where we are in planning with the HS2 between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and again what dialogue's taking place with the Department of Transport and HS2 in London with regards to what we're planning here in Scotland.
Yes, I don't think it's changed much from the last time I spoke to the committee about it. I think I said at that point that we would expect to have a business plan by, the government would expect to have a business plan by spring next year. Then we'll take some time to consider that for the Edinburgh to Glasgow high-speed rail link. I understand, and again Aidan would know more of this in detail, that we're having discussions with the UK government which are quite constructive, perhaps more so than they have been in the past, about the ability of Scotland to be put into the scheme to say that we have, if they call it a stage 3, although to go back to the earlier discussion about AWPR, we've never accepted that you have to start in the south and come north. We've always said, as we're doing with the Borders Railway, these things can be done at different points, and if you don't have the same legal planning and consensus issues in Scotland, such that there doesn't seem to be the opposition that has been elsewhere, then perhaps we could even make quicker progress in Scotland. So we are having discussions in relation to that with the DFT just now, but Aidan's involved in those, so he may be able to say more.
Yeah, as the Minister said, we've had constructive discussions around just the remit for the work going forward in terms of planning, route options, and for high speed beyond Manchester and Leeds to Scotland. So that's been very useful. There was a meeting in May around that. There's ongoing meetings subsequent to that with the Department of Transport, and there's also a reformation of the Scottish Partnership Group. There's a meeting on the 22nd of April, again just to update the Partnership Group in terms of progress made so far in terms of both the high-speed link to London, also proposals for Edinburgh, Glasgow, but also agree the remit of the group going forward and feeding into that work.
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener.
So can I just clarify, on the Edinburgh-Glasgow via Falkirk High line, do you have a timeline for the electrification of that, and when the end-to-end journey would likely to be falling to, I think it was 42 minutes or something?
I think we said previously that the electrification would take place by 2016, and that still remains our target. At that point, you have to then incorporate the rolling stock, which is suitable for electric lines, and that process will take us until 2018 to complete that part of the process. And that's when you get the full journey time reductions as well.
And that's 2018 would be when journey time likely to be 42 minutes.
There will be
end-to-end.
progressive improvements in the journey time between 2016 and 2018, but the full effect will be 2018, that's right.
And in relation to the Alloa Stirling Dunblane line, do you have a timeline for the electrification of that line?
Yeah, I think that is also 2018 that we expect to have that completed by. We had said before within the control period up to 2019, but we expect we can do that earlier, not least because there is work ongoing just now. I was on the line last night, and many of the bridges have already been raised to accommodate that work, so it should be 2018 we'll get that completed for. Although, having said that, we'd announced last week about the Whifflets project coming ahead 4 years ahead of schedule. I'm not about to announce that Alloa and Dunblane will be done 4 years ahead of schedule, but we have learnt lessons from the Paisley Corridor project where things can be done A, more quickly, and A, substantially more cost effectively, and we will keep an eye on any ways that we can bring forward any of those elements of the project.
Anyone got any final questions for the Minister? Okay, thank you very much, Minister. It gives you some more time to get up to Aberdeen for 3 o'clock. And can I thank you both very much and suspend briefly to allow the Minister and officials to leave. Thank you. Item on the agenda today is subordinate legislation. We need to consider a negative instrument on home energy efficiency as listed on the agenda. These regulations make provision for the making of grants to improve the thermal insulation and energy efficiency of dwellings and to provide advice to reduce or prevent the wastage of energy in a dwelling. The Subordinate Legislation Committee determined that it did not need to draw the instrument to the attention of Parliament. The committee is invited to consider any issues that it wishes to raise in reporting to Parliament on the instrument. Members should note that no motions to annul have been received in relation to this instrument. Does anyone have any comments it wishes to make on this instrument? Okay, the committee agreed that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? That is agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes our business in public for today. and we move into private session as previously agreed.